Yo bro, HEMA's a dumb martial art. Who walks around with swords or fights in the street with swords now? What's the point learning HEMA? It's no good for self-defense. It's rubbish martial arts. You're wrong. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, anybody who watches this channel will know that I talk a lot about HEMA, historical European martial arts, and some people might think that HEMA is a very specific thing. I'm going to talk a bit about that, but this is a response essentially to not just one, but a few comments that I've seen over the years, but also one specifically that I just saw under a video that I was just watching, where someone said, oh, HEMA's, fine as a hobby, but it's a stupid martial art because, you can't walk around with swords in the street, so it's useless, isn't it? That's wrong on so many levels, and I'm going to explain to you why. First up, bro, HEMA's not just swords, okay? I realise that a lot of people who talk about HEMA, like me, on the internet are freaking obsessed with swords, and we talk about swords a lot. And swords are glamorous weapons, I guess, that get lots of attention from nerds like me who collect swords and use swords and fence with swords. And it must be admitted that various sword styles are probably the most predominant forms of HEMA, or Western martial arts, historical fencing, whatever you want to call it, that is currently practiced today by the greatest number of people. Because playing with swords is fun. That's what most people want to do. While my personal focus isn't, for example, on longsword, I have done longsword for a long time. I was drawn initially to longsword and I still teach longsword. And most people who come to my classes want to learn longsword because longswords are freaking cool and they're what draw a lot of people into it. Once they're doing HEMA, they sometimes go off and they find they love a certain other type of sword or a certain other type of weapon. But the main point here is that HEMA isn't only just swords. The HEMA sources are hugely diverse and cover a whole range of weapons. And that's right, folks, a whole load of unarmed, unweaponed things as well. They also deal with fighting unarmed as well as armed, and teaching you how to fight unarmed against armed and to fight armed with different weapons against each other. So it's not only about fencing with swords, it's not only about medieval longswords, it's not only about Victorian sabres or Renaissance rapiers, it's also about wrestling, it's about boxing, it's about all types of grappling, very, very similar stuff to what we see in Asian martial arts like jiu-jitsu. All types of, throws and grips and locks and arm bars and breaks and all of these things, and with weapons thrown into the mix at the same time. So HEMA is not just swords, it's actually hugely diverse. If you want to study how medieval people wrestled to the death, you can do it. If you want to study how Renaissance people shanked each other with knives, you can do it. If you want to study how Latin Americans shanked each other with knives in the 19th century, you can do it. If you want to study how bare-knuckle boxers in Britain in the 18th century pummeled each other into bloody pulps, you can do it. It's all in HEMA. So the next reason I think HEMA is an awesome martial art to train compared to any other martial arts that are available is because we have a huge amount of cross-training. HEMA people are never shy to cross-train with other sword styles, Japanese swordsmanship, Chinese swordsmanship, Filipino sword and knife, or with the unarmed stuff. Absolutely tons of people in HEMA who are drawn towards the unarmed martial arts have backgrounds in MMA, in jiu-jitsu, in kung fu, in boxing, in various types of wrestling like catch wrestling. So they have backgrounds in those things. They don't usually do HEMA in isolation. Usually when we do, for example, a sword style, many of us, me for example, I've done modern fencing for many years at school and university and after university. And I've also done a little bit of Japanese swordsmanship as well, and I did Chinese martial arts before I started doing HEMA and crossing over as well at the same time. So we have a huge amount of cross-training. Not only do the people doing HEMA often have backgrounds external to HEMA, might be modern martial arts, might be MMA, like I say, if it's unarmed stuff, or might be things like Krav Maga, knife defense stuff, all sorts of diverse stuff. Whether it's weapons or unarmed, and a mixture of both, often unarmed against weapons or different types of weapons against each other. And in addition to that, we're totally open to cross-training with people who are doing Indian martial arts, African martial arts, various other types of Asian martial arts, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Thai, Vietnamese, and so on and so forth. So we are hugely into studying other martial arts and cross-training. Another major plus for HEMA is that we are massively, at least most of us, are massively into pressure testing. That means we don't just practice the techniques, we don't just look at what the book says to do, we actually try and make it work in, with non-cooperative opponents and very often in competitive sporting settings as well. So yeah, we will go and fence or wrestle or box, compete with people from other martial arts or against people from other clubs all over the world from different countries. So we're massively into pressure testing. We are not one of those martial arts, and let's face it, there are quite a lot of them out there, those martial arts who don't train outside of what they do. They don't really pressure test what they do. They don't really, compete against people from other traditions and this kind of stuff. They're totally really insular and internal. We're not like that. We actually go and pressure test what we think we can do against people who are trying to stop us from doing it. The final thing that I want you to consider in my rebuttal against saying that HEMA is a rubbish martial art to study in the modern world for any sort of practical martial arts or self-defense purposes is that actually, putting the sword down, let's be frank about this, HEMA, because it's so diverse and deals with unarmed and armed and unarmed against armed and different types of weapons against each other, actually means that we've got a massive repertoire to draw upon, and let's face it, we deal with weapons more than most other martial arts do, okay? So some other martial arts deal entirely with weapons, if you take, Kenjutsu or Kendo, for example, but they pretty much mostly deal with sword versus sword. We, however, often deal with daggers. We look at defense against dagger. We look at knives used against knives. We look at knives used against swords. We look at swords used against spears. And so we are extremely familiar with weapons. And I actually consider in the modern world, yes, indeed, most fights, thankfully, that happen are going to be what we'd call fisticuffs. So they're going to be a brawl without weapons involved. But when we talk about risk to your life, okay, in the modern world or historically, the fact is that the biggest risk to your life is someone using a weapon on you. Now, I understand that many people will go, guns! And yeah, okay, shooting, believe it or not, is also a historical European martial art. I shoot black powder weapons, I shoot 19th century style guns and modern guns as well. However, putting guns to one side for a second, if someone's likely to take your life with a weapon that isn't a gun, it's likely to be one of these. It's likely to be some form of knife. Statistically in Britain, most likely a kitchen knife or a screwdriver. Now in HEMA, we actually train with knives and against knives and knife against knife. So we're actually really, I think, proportionately really well equipped. And you can take the best cage fighter out there, you can take the best MMA or jiu-jitsu person around. How often do they actually train against knives? Not very often, okay? If you're considering a knife fight, knife against knife, a HEMA person who week in, week out does some sparring with a knife against another person with a knife, yeah, it's simulated and it's friendly and you're wearing safety gear, but you have a lot more time on the mats training with knives or any other weapon than most other martial arts out there do. So I think HEMA should get recognition for that, and that is one of the reasons that many modern militaries are actually starting to look at some of the things that HEMA do. And I know people involved in the HEMA scene who are also involved in the military, and they're starting to incorporate knife fighting, dagger defense, other things into the mixed modern martial arts repertoire that they're actually teaching to people who might actually have to get into a situation where they're dealing with someone trying to shank them repeatedly. This is true of the police as well, and I've been involved in consulting on that. So, HEMA, is it a useless martial art in the modern world? Well, we can always say for sport and for fun, nothing's useless. Anything you fight, it could be role-playing games, video games, it could be making curtains, it could be knitting, it could be stroking your dog, or, I don't know, swimming. Anything that gives you enjoyment and happiness is worth doing. But as a martial art, as a defense thing, I absolutely don't think that HEMA is useless at all, and in some ways I think it's superior to a lot of the other martial arts out there in the modern day for the reasons aforementioned. I hope this has been thought-provoking. I'm sure this will enrage some people, and hey-ho, that's life. That will always happen on the internet, but maybe some of you others, it will maybe make you look at HEMA a little bit differently. Remember, knife fighting, wrestling of various types, boxing, knife defense, using mixed weapons against each other, multiple opponent scenarios. They are all within HEMA. HEMA is not only fencing one person with a sword against one person with a sword. It's much, much bigger than that, and we pressure test this stuff to heck. Okay, thanks for watching, folks. I have been Matt Easton. I will be the next time, I promise you, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.